You're listening ad-free on Amazon Music. Just before 8 a.m. on the morning of September 25, 1944, a police officer patrolled Day Street in Lower Manhattan in New York City. He passed the usual morning bustle, factory workers leaving the subway, telephone operators on their way to the nearby telephone and telegraph building, a food truck unloading vegetables at a dingy corner market, and someone begging for change outside an abandoned warehouse. Then, the officer noticed what looked like a heap of clothing just lying on the sidewalk ahead of him. The officer sighed and shook his head. He hated litter and took a lot of pride in keeping his streets clean. So the officer approached this pile of clothes, looking for a trash can to dump it in. But as he got closer, the officer realized this pile of clothes was actually an elderly man in a shabby overcoat. He was doubled over and clutching his stomach. The officer felt annoyed as the smell of stale alcohol and body odor rose from the old man's coat. He figured this man was just drunk after a long night out. So the officer bent down and shook the man's shoulder, asking if he was okay. Then, without warning, the old man turned over and vomited onto the sidewalk. The officer jumped back to avoid getting puke on his shoes. This old man was clearly very drunk and so could not be left on the streets alone. The officer had no choice but to arrest him for public intoxication. But as the officer reached for his handcuffs, he stopped because he noticed something very odd about this old man. His nose, lips, ears, and fingers were all as blue as the sky above. It was so strange that it took a moment for the officer to register what he was even seeing. Then, between this guy's blue skin, the glazed-over look on his face, and the vomit on the sidewalk, it clicked. This was not public intoxication, this was a medical emergency. So the officer ran to a payphone and called dispatch and requested an ambulance. Luckily, there was an emergency room close by at Beekman Downtown Hospital. The hospital was only 6 blocks away, so an ambulance arrived in just a matter of minutes. The officer helped one of the emergency responders hoist the old man off the sidewalk and onto a stretcher, and then they loaded him into the back of the ambulance. The officer took a step back as the ambulance driver closed the door and then sped away. After the ambulance had disappeared around the corner and the police officer had resumed his beat, he thought to himself, in all his years on the force, that might have been the strangest thing he'd ever come across. A few minutes later, an attending physician named Dr. Francis Stevens ran outside of Beekman Downtown Hospital. He'd been notified about the incoming patient with the sky blue skin, and now he was rushing to meet the ambulance, pulling up out in front. Dr. Stevens helped the ambulance driver pull out a stretcher, and then using it, they carried the old man inside. The driver explained that although the old man had been awake when he was loaded into the ambulance, he had lost consciousness during the short drive to the hospital. Dr. Stevens nodded, guessing that his new patient had likely passed out from shock. He could tell from the man's skin color alone that his heart must not be pumping enough blood through his body, which meant he was at risk of a heart attack. As they transferred the old man from his stretcher to an actual hospital bed, Dr. Stevens saw that nearly half of this man's body had turned blue. Dr. Stevens jumped into action. They only had minutes to supply the old man's body with oxygen and then get his heart to pump it through his bloodstream. Without immediate treatment, this man would die. Dr. Stevens figured that the old man must have ingested something that made him this sick, so he raced to pump the man's stomach until he was sure it was empty. This meant that whatever had made him sick hopefully would not be able to do any more damage. The doctor then strapped an oxygen mask over the old man's face to increase the oxygen in his blood and then gave him stimulants to help his heart pump more efficiently. After this, there was nothing to do but wait. Dr. Stevens looked at the old man lying unconscious in the bed, his skin still bright blue, and the doctor just hoped they had treated him in time to save his life. Later that morning, Dr. Stevens returned to check on the old man and found him lying in bed, fully awake. His lips and fingertips did have a bluish tinge still, but the effect clearly had dramatically lessened. The man said his name was William and that he was 82 years old, and then after that he began looking around the room with very suspicious eyes and demanded to know what had happened to him. Dr. Stevens told William that he had been suffering from a condition known as cyanosis that results from inadequate oxygen in the bloodstream. Cyanosis is known for causing people's skin to turn blue. It was a rare condition, and they weren't sure why William had gotten it. Although Dr. Stevens could assure William that for the time being, the best treatment available was just to rest. This answer did not seem to satisfy William because his next question was, well, when do I get to go home? But before Dr. Stevens could answer him, the doors of the emergency room burst open and another unconscious man was carried into the waiting room. Dr. Stevens rushed from William's side to help this new patient. As the man was laid onto a bed, Dr. Stevens stopped and just stared at him with a look of surprise on his face. This new patient was also an old man dressed in tattered clothes, and as Dr. Stevens bent over him, he noticed that, just like William, this old man's lips, nose, and fingers were also bright blue. So Dr. Stevens administered the same treatment he'd just given William: a stomach pump, an oxygen mask, and heart stimulants. But as he was working on this new patient, Dr. Stevens started to have this sinking feeling in his gut. 2 cyanosis cases on the same day? What was that about? He knew that in rare cases, cyanosis was a symptom of carbon monoxide poisoning. He worried that there might be a gas leak in a nearby building, and in a neighborhood as crowded as Lower Manhattan, that could be disastrous. Dr. Stevens was able to stabilize this new patient's condition, but the doctor didn't have a moment to rest. Almost immediately after this second patient was stable, he heard another ambulance pull up out front, and seconds later, 3 more people were carried in. And from across the room, Dr. Stevens could already see that all 3 of them were elderly, run-down men, and they were all bright blue. Now, Beekman Downtown Hospital had a total of 5 cyanosis patients. Dr. Stevens and his staff worked through the entire morning to save these 3 new blue patients, and then just before lunch, 2 more blue men were carried in, and 10 minutes later, another 2. Dr. Stevens was totally confused. Something in the city had to be making all these men sick, but it just was not clear what it was. By noon, there were 9 ragged elderly men who had blue skin who were laid out in the hospital's beds. Dr. Stevens and his staff ran from bed to bed, administering treatment until all 9 men were totally stabilized and their skin was slowly turning back to its normal color. It was only then that Dr. Stevens had a moment to step back and actually go look at the men's admission papers. These documents revealed that all of the men had been found on sidewalks or in condemned buildings all around the neighborhood. Dr. Stevens didn't know what to make of this, but the fact that the men were coming from different places meant that a single gas leak probably could not have made them all sick. But if it wasn't gas poisoning, what was making these men turn blue? Dr. Stevens worried it could be some kind of airborne illness or virus, and so even though Dr. Stevens did not really know what was going on, he knew it was now time to report this outbreak to the Department of Health. About an hour later, a field epidemiologist with the New York Department of Health named Dr. Ottavio Pelletieri walked through the doors of Beekman Downtown Hospital. He showed his identification to the receptionist and asked to speak with the physician who was in charge. Dr. Pelletieri's job was to investigate possible outbreaks of disease. His eyes wandered around the emergency room. Of the 9 blue-skinned patients laying in the beds against the wall, only 5 of them were awake. Dr. Pelletieri focused on William, who was the first patient brought in that morning. William was sitting upright in his bed, his skin still somewhat blue, but he was clearly feeling better. Dr. Pelletieri walked over and introduced himself. He asked William about his morning. The old man coughed into his fist and then thought for a moment. He said at first it was just an ordinary day. He'd woken up in a nearby rooming house called the Globe Hotel, which was a crumbling, dingy building filled with as many twin beds as possible. After waking up, William said that he wandered down to breakfast at the Eclipse cafeteria, where low-income people could get a hot meal very cheap. He ate some oatmeal and drank some coffee, and then started back to his boarding house. And when he reached the sidewalk right outside of the Globe Hotel, he suddenly started feeling these stabbing pains inside of his stomach. Then he fell to the ground, and the next thing he knew, he was in this hospital bed. Just as Dr. Pelletieri was about to open his mouth to ask William some follow-up questions, the cyanosis patient in the next bed over piped up and said that he also had eaten at the Eclipse cafeteria that morning. Dr. Pelletieri raised his eyebrows. He stepped away from William's bed and asked the 5 conscious patients if they'd also eaten at Eclipse that morning. And all of them nodded yes, they had. Dr. Pelletieri now knew where to start his investigation. Something obviously was wrong at the Eclipse cafeteria. The question was whether there was a carbon monoxide leak there or if something else in the restaurant had made these men sick. It could be food poisoning, though Dr. Pelletieri thought this was unlikely since the symptoms of food poisoning usually take at least 12 hours to manifest, and these men had passed out from pain and shock within just minutes of leaving the Eclipse cafeteria. Dr. Pelletieri then thought of something else that could have caused this quick and sudden illness. He took another sweeping look at the 5 conscious men in front of him and told them he had one more question. He promised they would not be in trouble, but he just had to know whether any of them had used a drug such as heroin that morning. There was a pause as the men stared back at him, but then all of them shook their heads no, and then told Dr. Pelletieri that they were actually drinkers, not drug users. They were all so serious that Dr. Pelletieri immediately believed them. Just then, a nurse walked up behind Dr. Pelletieri and tapped him on the shoulder. She pointed across the room to Dr. Stevens, the ER doctor, who was striding toward him. Dr. Pelletieri gave Dr. Stevens a nod and met him halfway across the room, extending a handshake. After the men shook hands, Dr. Pelletieri explained that he would need blood samples from all 9 patients. They'd be sent to the city toxicologist for overnight testing. Dr. Stevens nodded and agreed to help. For the next 10 minutes, the two of them moved from patient to patient, collecting small vials of blood and labeling them carefully. By the time they were done, all but one of the cyanosis patients were awake. The only one who remained asleep was a man named John Marshall. He was laid out in the bed closest to the wall, fully unconscious, skin still pale blue. Dr. Pelletieri looked John up and down before labeling his blood and placing it in a small box with the other samples. It was clear to Dr. Pelletieri that whatever had made these men sick, John must have gotten the worst of it. Dr. Pelletieri grabbed his briefcase full of samples and then left the emergency room. He dropped the samples at his office for testing and then head straight to the Eclipse cafeteria. If he could figure out what had happened, there might still be time to save John's life. Around 5 o'clock that afternoon, Dr. Pelletieri arrived at the Eclipse cafeteria to find it closed and locked up. But the lights were on inside, so the doctor knocked on the dingy glass door. When there was no answer, he knocked again, announcing himself loudly as a member of the health department. Finally, he saw someone inside pop out of the kitchen and hurry across the dining room. The man was dressed in a well-tailored trench coat and wore a suit. He unlocked the front door and opened it for Dr. Pelletieri and then introduced himself as Mr. Weinberg and said he was from the New York Bureau of Food and Drugs. He explained to Dr. Pelletieri that a secretary from the New York Department of Health had already called his office. Now that a restaurant was potentially responsible for the cyanosis outbreak, his department needed to be involved. Dr. Pelletieri felt grateful for the unexpected help, and so he stepped inside of the Eclipse cafeteria, and right away he was hit with this horrible smell. It was like an algae-filled aquarium. Dr. Pelletieri thought there must be so much mold lurking behind all the filthy and cracked tile walls. This place was so overdue for a proper cleaning that an inch of black grit clung to every corner of the floor. Dr. Pelletieri looked around the rest of the room, and he saw fruit flies climbing the walls. There were 17 rickety tables that filled the dining room, each with its own sticky bottle of ketchup and salt and pepper shakers. Weinberg told Dr. Pelletieri that he had not found a gas leak anywhere inside, but he'd already cited the cafeteria with 15 separate health code violations. The kitchen was even more disgusting than the dining room. A thick layer of grease clung to every surface, bags of rotting garbage sat beneath the kitchen sinks. Dr. Pelletieri picked up a fork lying on the counter, and a thick layer of starch coated the fork prongs. To him, everything inside of this cafe was a potential contaminant. It was only then that Dr. Pelletieri noticed the cook and the restaurant owner standing beside the oven. Dr. Pelletieri was even more surprised to find that both men looked genuinely upset, maybe even afraid. Dr. Pelletieri felt relieved. Usually, restaurant owners were combative when the health department showed up, but he guessed that these men were going to be cooperative. If they had something to do with these 9 men getting sick, it seemed very much like it was an accident. Dr. Pelletieri wanted to speak with the line cook first. He asked the man if he did anything different than usual when he cooked breakfast that morning. The line cook shook his head and said no. He had made the usual breakfast of oatmeal, rolls, and coffee, nothing different than every other morning. Dr. Pelletieri then followed the cook to the pantry, taking note of the type of dry cereal the cook had used to make 6 gallons of oatmeal. Then the cook led Dr. Pelletieri to the giant metal stock pot that he had used to both cook the oatmeal and then serve the oatmeal, enough to serve 125 people that morning. The cook rattled off the recipe: 5 pounds of that dry cereal, 4 gallons of city tap water, and a handful of salt. The cook gestured to a gallon can of salt sitting on the stove, and then he pointed to a series of canisters sitting on a shelf just above the stove. The cook explained they stored the salt there in bulk, then just refilled the salt can on the stove as needed. Dr. Pelletieri said he wanted to take samples from everything the men had cooked with that morning. Then the doctor grabbed a step stool to reach the canisters labeled table salt above the oven. And when he was up there and was eye level with these canisters, he noticed there was a different canister hidden amongst them, one that did not have a label. Dr. Pelletieri lifted that can off the shelf and looked inside, and to him, it just looked like table salt. But just to be sure, Dr. Pelletieri climbed down from the stepladder and then showed this unlabeled can of white crystals to the cook and said, "What is this?" The cook explained that this can contained something known as saltpeter, which was a preservative he used to make corned beef and pastrami. The cook said he did not use the saltpeter to make oatmeal. For that, he used regular table salt. Dr. Pelletieri nodded, but just in case, he took a small sample of the saltpeter with him. For a moment, Dr. Pelletieri wondered if maybe there had been some kind of a mix-up and the cook had used saltpeter instead of table salt. But even if that had been the case, that would not have been what made all 9 of those men sick. Saltpeter was not toxic. Once Dr. Pelletieri had a bag full of all the samples he needed, he left the Eclipse cafeteria, hoping he would never have to return. Then he headed for the health department chemist's office. He needed these samples tested for poison overnight, along with the blood samples that he'd dropped off earlier. Dr. Pelletieri really wanted to get back to the hospital to check in on the 9 patients. But first, he had to make sure that this cyanosis outbreak was contained and that he was aware of every single cyanosis patient being treated right now in the city. He spent the next several hours visiting every cheap rooming house in the neighborhood, as well as all the nearby hospitals, until he was certain that the only cyanosis victims that were being dealt with right now were the 9 at the Beekman Downtown Hospital. When Dr. Pelletieri finally returned to the Beekman Downtown Hospital, it was well after midnight. And when he got there, a nurse greeted him and told him that since he had left the hospital that afternoon, 2 more elderly men had arrived with cyanosis, so blue skin. That brought the official count up to 11. Most of them were awake now and back to their normal coloring, but the sickest patient, John Marshall, still lay unconscious in his bed by the wall, and his situation seemed to only be getting worse. Dr. Pelletieri frowned and then thanked the nurse for the update. Then he headed back out the door toward his office to write his initial report, summarizing his investigation for his boss, Dr. Morris Greenberg, the city's chief epidemiologist. The next morning, Dr. Pelletieri had to go back to the Eclipse cafeteria, even though he really didn't want to. He was exhausted, having stayed up most of the night writing his report for his boss. But to continue his investigation, he would need to speak with more members of the kitchen staff. When he got there, the cafeteria was still closed because of the health department citations, but the busboys and cashiers were waiting for Dr. Pelletieri inside the dining room. He chatted with each of them, following them around the cafeteria as they pantomimed their workdays. It didn't take long for Dr. Pelletieri to conclude that their actions had not contributed to the cyanosis cases in any significant way. But as Dr. Pelletieri packed up his belongings and got ready to leave, the cook from the day before appeared in the dining room with a fearful look on his face. He admitted to Dr. Pelletieri that he'd been up all night worrying that maybe, just maybe, he did accidentally season the oatmeal with saltpeter, not table salt, and if so, he was incredibly sorry. Dr. Pelletieri clapped the man's shoulder and thanked him for the honesty, but assured him not to worry. Since saltpeter is edible, it would not have hurt anyone if he had made that mix-up. The cook visibly relaxed, and Dr. Pelletieri smiled and wished him a good afternoon. Within an hour, Dr. Pelletieri made it back to the Department of Health to find a note on his desk from his supervisor, Dr. Greenberg. The test results from all the Eclipse cafeteria food samples had come back, and Greenberg wanted to see Dr. Pelletieri immediately. Dr. Greenberg was sitting at his desk, looking over the results, when Dr. Pelletieri showed up and knocked on his doorframe. Greenberg looked up for a moment and waved Dr. Pelletieri in. And then once Dr. Pelletieri took a seat, Greenberg handed him a copy of the results. And as Dr. Pelletieri read the findings, his eyes went wide. The cook had, in fact, accidentally refilled the gallon can of salt on his stove with saltpeter instead of table salt. But that was not the issue. The problem was that both the table salt and the saltpeter contained measurable levels of sodium nitrite, a meat preservative that can be poisonous if not handled carefully. Dr. Pelletieri knew that sodium nitrite wasn't dangerous in small doses, but large quantities of it could be deadly. For a moment, Dr. Pelletieri wondered how sodium nitrite could have gotten into the kitchen in the first place. It was more common at processing plants where meats like salami, hot dogs, and bacon were cured. And then Dr. Pelletieri remembered that because the nation was in the middle of World War II, the government had approved the use of limited concentrations of sodium nitrite in restaurants to make foods last longer. The sodium nitrite had to be used in very low concentrations that would preserve the meat, but allow any poisonous elements to burn off during the cooking process. But there was a big problem with the way the Eclipse cafeteria was using their sodium nitrite. The cooks were not just using it to preserve meat. They were also using it to season the morning oatmeal. And this was a critical mistake because oatmeal is not cooked nearly as long as meat is. During the longer meat cooking process, the toxins in sodium nitrite evaporate. But with oatmeal, they don't evaporate, and so when the cooks served it to the men, the toxins were definitely still in the oatmeal. And if that was not enough poison, the 11 men who were hospitalized had apparently gotten a whole lot more sodium nitrite straight from the salt shaker on their tables. Lab tests showed that one of the shakers at the Eclipse contained excess sodium nitrite, easily enough to sicken someone. Dr. Pelletieri put the lab results down and smiled. He finally had his answer. He would tell the restaurant about the mix-up right away, and as for the 11 blue men at the hospital, they were unlikely to suffer any long-term health problems from what had happened to them. Dr. Pelletieri thanked Dr. Greenberg, then got up to go spread the good news. That evening, Dr. Pelletieri stopped by the Beekman downtown emergency room on his way home. When he arrived, he learned that 10 of the 11 blue men had been released with a clean bill of health. When he called Dr. Greenberg to let him know, Greenberg said it was nothing short of a miracle. All of the survivors were self-proclaimed alcoholics, and alcoholics often crave salt. He was sure that all of them added salt liberally to their food, unwittingly putting their lives in danger. Dr. Pelletieri agreed, and he wanted to tell these men how lucky they were, but the survivors had been discharged and had all returned to their transient lives out on the streets. He knew he would likely never find them again. Still, they were part of a special group, survivors of being poisoned with sodium nitrite, an event so rare there were only 10 other cases of it ever in recorded history. But that was no help for the 11th blue man, John Marshall. His health had been so bad prior to consuming this sodium nitrite that he had died earlier that evening. Dr. Pelletieri's throat felt tight when he heard that news. He'd conducted his investigation as quickly as possible, but it still was not fast enough to save everyone. On September 12, 1982, two off-duty Alaska police officers were off hunting in a very remote section of Alaska about 20 miles away from Anchorage. The only way to get out to this area was by plane or by boat, and so generally speaking, the only people that came into this area were big-time hunters. After a long day, the two men realized it was starting to get dark and they were still deep in the woods, and so they decided it was time to turn around and start heading back to camp. The journey through the woods was challenging, and so the men walked down to the nearby Kinnick River and walked across an exposed sandbar. And as they walked, they noticed up ahead there was a boot sticking out of the sand. And as they got closer, they realized it wasn't just a boot. There was also a human leg bone still in the boot. Being police officers, they knew the importance of not disturbing a potential crime scene, and so instead they marked on the map where they were, they left the area, and they reported the body to their department. The following day, crime scene technicians came out to that remote area and they very carefully unearthed the remains, which still had women's clothing on them. And then afterwards, they began searching for evidence in the area, and eventually they discovered a single shell casing that was a .223 caliber round, which is a common caliber for hunting rifles. The remains were sent back to the lab for an autopsy, and it was revealed this person was a female and she had most likely died at least 6 months earlier. And she had almost certainly been the victim of a homicide because she had died from 3 gunshot wounds. Also during the autopsy, it was discovered that there were no bullet holes on any of her clothing, and so it appeared that she had been shot without her clothes on, and then her killer presumably redressed her. Also, they found a hospital bandage wrapped up in her clothing that appeared to have been wrapped around her head, leading some to speculate that she had been blindfolded before she was shot. A couple of weeks after the autopsy, dental records came back and they identified the body as belonging to 23-year-old Sherry Morrow. Sherry was an exotic dancer from Anchorage who had been reported missing 10 months earlier. In her missing persons report, it was stated that the last thing she told her friends was she had been offered $300 to have pictures taken of her by a professional photographer, and she was going to meet this man right before she disappeared. While police were fairly certain that Sherry's killer was this so-called photographer, they had no evidence that would allow them to search for this person. They had nothing. All they had was this shell casing that was commonly used amongst hunters. And there's lots of hunters in Alaska. So the police reported the finding of Sherry's body to the media in hopes that when they put that out to the world, that someone from the public would reach out with more information. During the police's press conference, one of the reporters asked them, do you think Sherry's death is connected to the other unsolved deaths in that part of Alaska? What they were referencing was 2 years earlier, 2 other women's bodies had been discovered in that rough area where Sherry had been found. One of the women was so badly decomposed there was no way to identify her. However, it was revealed she was probably in her late teens or early 20s. The other woman was able to be identified. It was 24-year-old Joanne Messina, who was an exotic dancer from Anchorage. But there was virtually no evidence at either of the 2 women's grave sites, and so their deaths remained a mystery. Publicly, at this press conference, the police told reporters that they did not believe Sherry's death was connected to those 2 other women. But privately, some officers had their suspicions. Not only had these 3 women met similar fates in a similar area, but over the past couple of years, there had been a significant increase in missing people out of Anchorage, Alaska. And most of these missing people were young women that were either exotic dancers or prostitutes. This convinced many officers that they were dealing with a serial killer, but there just wasn't any evidence to actually prove it, so they couldn't come out and say it publicly. Over the following year, no new information came out about Sherry Morrow or the other 2 deceased women that had been found in that same area, and so all 3 of their cases just continued to languish. Meanwhile, more and more exotic dancers and prostitutes were going missing out of Anchorage, and no one knew why. Then, on June 13th, 1983, the police got a break. Early that morning, a man driving a truck turned onto a quiet Anchorage highway, and as he was making his way down the road, he saw up ahead on the side, there was this woman running towards him, screaming with her hands over her head, and she wasn't wearing pants or shoes. And so obviously he knew something was wrong, and so he pulled over, and as this woman is charging up towards him, he notices she has a handcuff on one of her wrists, and she appears to be a lot younger than he initially thought. She's probably in her late teens. And so she comes running up to his car. He unlocks the passenger side door. She flings herself inside without even asking for permission. She slams the door behind her and then ducks down to keep her head out of the window like she's trying to hide from something out there. Now, this man looked out and he didn't see anyone or anything, but he wasn't going to wait around for whatever it was she was scared of. And so he just made a gut decision to take this girl away from here. And so he peeled off and drove down the road. And the girl, who was very shaken up, couldn't even tell this guy what was going on. She just asked him to please drop her off at a nearby motel. And the man didn't ask any questions. He drove her to the motel and he dropped her off. The girl ran inside and up to her room. And when she ran inside, the motel receptionist sees this girl running in. I mean, she doesn't have her pants on. She's got a handcuff on. She looks terrified. And so she called the police. A few minutes later, the police showed up. They went up to this girl's room. They knocked on the door. The girl opened it up and she was obviously very scared, and she allowed the police inside, and she told them her name was Cindy Paulson and she was 17 years old. The police recognized this girl is terrified. She's not a threat. And so they removed the one handcuff that was still on her. And then they asked her, what happened? And the police officers would say her story was just horrible.
But what stood out to them was not how disturbing the story was, it was how composed and brave this girl was as she told it. This is her story. The night before, Cindy was working the streets of Anchorage. She was a prostitute, and a car pulled up, and inside was this wiry, bearded guy with glasses who seemed kind of slight and harmless, and he asked to buy her services. And because she didn't view him as a threat, she agreed and hopped in his passenger seat, and as soon as she sat down, he reached over and put a handcuff on one wrist, and then drew a gun on her and told her to be quiet. And then he drove her to this fairly nice neighborhood, pulled into a driveway, he got her out of the car and led her into this house, and he brought her along downstairs into the basement, where as soon as she got down there was a dim light, and she saw there was a chain swinging from the ceiling. And he strung her up onto that chain, and for hours he assaulted her. And then after he grew tired of doing that, he told her he was going to go take a nap, and when he came back, they were going to leave this house and go out to his cabin in the woods. At this point, she begged him to let her go, but he really didn't care. He just told her that if she made any noise or tried to escape at any point, he would have to kill her. And then he walked out of the room. And for the next several hours, Cindy remained chained to the ceiling with half of her clothes off, wondering what horrible thing was going to happen to her next. Eventually, her attacker came back in the room, and he untied her from her chain, and he walked her upstairs to his living room, where he very proudly showed her a number of hunting trophies he had, and he began telling her about how much he loved hunting and where he went hunting. And it was at this point that Cindy realized this guy has no intention of keeping her alive. He's shown her his face, his house, his car. He's told her about places he likes to go and things he likes to do. He's given her all this information about himself. She is a huge liability to him. And so it dawned on her that if she didn't find a way to escape, she was going to die. After the trophy tour, the man led Cindy back out to her car, he put her inside, and then he drove to a nearby small airport where he said his plane was. And so he pulled over to their hangar, he got her out of the car, and he put her inside of the plane. And as Cindy is sitting in the plane, she's watching this guy load gun after gun and bag after bag of what looks like military supplies into this plane. And so she knows that this is the moment. I have to escape right now, because as soon as this plane takes off, I'm done for. And so at some point when this guy went over to his car to get something, and his back was turned to her, she jumped out of the cockpit of this plane, she fell to the ground, she got up and just began running out of the hangar. And she managed to get out of the hangar and began turning the corner and running towards this forest right as she hears this guy charging after her, screaming that he's going to catch her and kill her. And so she just keeps running for her life all the way into this forest, all the way to that highway, before she finally stopped and turned around and she saw the man had stopped following her. This is when she went onto the highway and she flagged down the guy in the truck who brought her to the motel. The police were shocked by her story. It sounded totally unbelievable, but she was so genuinely scared and so detailed that they believed her. And so they told her they would have to bring her to the hospital, and on their way to the hospital, she demanded they go back to that airport that she had been held at so she can try to identify the hangar she had been in, and hopefully the plane would still be in there. And so the police comply, they go into the airport, and Cindy points out the hangar she believes she was in. And when they get there, the plane she had been on was still there, but the man, her attacker, was not there. And so the police got out and they began taking down notes about the plane, its different tag numbers and what it looked like. And while they're standing there, the security guard from the airport came over because he saw the police cars, and he told the officers that the night before he had seen the owner of the plane they're looking at acting very suspiciously with something inside of his car. And so on a hunch, he had recorded that man's license plate number, and he gave that number to police. And so the police were able to use that license plate number and some of the numbers on the plane to figure out who owned both vehicles. And it was a local man named Robert Hansen who owned a very successful bakery downtown. After dropping Cindy off at the hospital, the police officers decided to pay a visit to Robert Hansen at his house. When they got there, Robert was actually pulling into his driveway right at the same time, and they saw his car matched the description that Cindy had given of his car. And then when Robert got out of his car, he matched the description that Cindy had given of her attacker. When Robert saw the police parked outside of his house, he immediately invited them over and said, what can I help you with? And the police said, we'd like to talk to you. Can we go inside? Robert invited them inside, and when the police went into his house, it matched the description that Cindy had given of his house with all the hunting trophies everywhere. And so they sat down and they asked him what he was doing the night before, and he said he had spent the night with some friends, and he had their contact information, and if you needed to talk to them, you could, but they would say he was with them. When the police asked if they could have a look around his property, Robert immediately consented and said, you can look anywhere you want. And so the police searched his property, but found no signs that Cindy had been attacked there. And And so they thanked him for his hospitality and they left. Once they got back to their station, they checked in with Robert's two friends he claimed he was with the night before, and they each independently corroborated Robert's story, saying that yes, he was with them from this time to this time. And so it appeared, as unlikely as it seemed, that Robert was telling the truth. And so the police went back to Cindy and they said, are you sure that everything you told us is exactly as you remember it? You didn't exaggerate anything? This is the truth? And Cindy said, absolutely. And they said, okay, well, are you prepared to take a lie detector test to prove that you're telling the truth? And Cindy said, no. Now, it's unclear why she said no. Maybe it was a general distrust of the police, but either way, when she said no, it immediately cast an enormous amount of doubt on her story in the eyes of the police. And when Cindy started to pick up that the police really didn't believe her anymore, she got spooked and just left town. And after that, her case and Robert Hansen were largely forgotten about. But 3 months later, on September 2nd, all of that changed. On that day, a construction crew was doing some work on a backcountry road not far from where those 3 women's bodies had been found. And at some point, one of their machines uncovered some human remains. The police were called in, who pulled up the rest of the remains. And then, just like in Sherry Morrow's case, when they looked for evidence around this new body, they found a single shell casing from a .223 caliber round. The remains were brought back for an autopsy, where it was determined that the body was female and she had died from several gunshot wounds. Using dental records, they were able to identify this woman as being 17-year-old Paula Goulding, who was an exotic dancer who had gone missing 5 months prior from Anchorage. The police sent the .223 shell casing found in Paula's gravesite, along with the other .223 shell casing found in Sherry Morrow's gravesite, to a lab to be analyzed. And it was quickly determined that both of these rounds had been fired from the same rifle, and therefore both women had most likely been killed by the same person. This was the moment the police knew they were dealing with a serial killer, and many police officers wanted it to be Robert Hansen. He seemed like the guy, but he had a rock-solid alibi and they had no hard evidence against him. And so without any other suspects, the police turned to a famous FBI profiler, a guy by the name of John Douglas, and they asked him to build a profile of who he think killed Sherry Morrow and Paula Goulding. And when John's report came back, the police were shocked. The profile described a man in his 40s who blended in easily with society. He was well-liked and got along with people and was just a normal guy. And he was successful, probably because he owned a successful business. He was an avid outdoorsman and hunter, and he most likely had a significant speech defect, like a lisp or a stutter. The profile was perfectly describing Robert Hansen. And because of John Douglas's prolific success in correctly identifying killers based on his profiles, when a judge saw this particular profile and saw how neatly it lined up with Robert Hansen, he gave the FBI a search warrant for Robert's house. And this time they would find very damning evidence, like a map of the local area. It was a hunting map, and on it there were 37 X's marked off. And some of those X's coincided with the same area where those 4 women's bodies had been found. They also found a .223 caliber rifle, along with a bag of women's jewelry that contained a necklace belonging to Sherry Morrow. As the FBI was carrying evidence out of Robert's house into their truck, a neighbor walked over after seeing all the commotion, and she walked up to one of the agents, and she was very skittish and anxious, and she said, my husband, he's friends with Robert, and he recently pretended to be an alibi for Robert. He had no idea how much trouble he was in, and I certainly didn't know, but I want you guys to know that my husband was lying. He was not with Robert on the night that he said he was. This was the proverbial nail in the coffin for Robert Hansen, because now, without this alibi, he had nothing to hide behind. And so when the police approached Robert with their overwhelming evidence against him between what they found in his house and this now recanted statement from his former alibi, Robert said, okay, I'm going to confess. But there was a catch. He was only willing to confess to murdering the 4 women whose bodies had already been found by police. Now, the police knew Robert had almost definitely killed more people, and so at this point, they just wanted to know who the other victims were and where they were. And so they offered Robert a deal where he would confess to those 4 murders and then give additional information about other victims, where they were located, who they were, what happened to them. In exchange, they would not prosecute him on any other victims he named. And so Robert agreed to these terms, he signed the deal, and then he gave a full, horrifying confession. He said he would drive around Anchorage at night and look for young, vulnerable women that were all alone. These were usually prostitutes out on the street, or they were exotic dancers he would try to befriend inside of clubs. And when he approached these women, he would tell them he was a professional photographer and he thought they were beautiful and he wanted to take photos of them, and he would pay them for the photo shoot. And many of these women were aspiring models and they were really excited at this idea, and so they would agree to go. And so Robert would tell them to meet him the next day at a particular location, which was usually a fast food restaurant, and Robert would show up much earlier and he would hide in his car and he would wait to see when they showed up if they were alone or not. And when he saw they were alone and they had no one to help them, he would drive up and he would ask them to get in his car. What these women couldn't see was on the inside of the passenger side door was a handcuff that was already latched on to the door itself, and there was an open cuff waiting for them as soon as they got in. They would get in the car, he would reach over them and act like he was helping them put on their seatbelt, and then as they're kind of looking at him, wondering what he's doing, he would grab their wrist, throw it in the open handcuff, and then he would draw a pistol and hold it against their head and say, "Be quiet." During his confession, Robert bragged to police that he had done this so many times, putting the handcuff on and drawing the pistol, that it was like muscle memory for him. Once he had the women handcuffed inside of his car, he would drive them back to his house and he would bring them into his basement and he would chain them up to the ceiling just like Cindy had described. And then after assaulting them for hours, he would take them out of his basement, put them in his car, drive out to the airport. He would put them in his plane, but unlike Cindy, these women didn't escape. And he would take off and he would fly them out to his cabin, which was not far from where those 4 bodies had been found. Once he got the women into his cabin, he would undress them and put a blindfold on them, and then with their handcuffs still on, he would assist them out the front door and tell them to run. And they would take off as fast as they could into the woods, running into trees, falling over, but just running for their lives, believing their ordeal was now over. They just had to get away from this guy. But what they didn't know is their ordeal was just starting. Robert had no intention of allowing them to escape. He knew there was deep water that surrounded his cabin, and so if they actually made it that far to the water's edge, they would drown. And so Robert would give these women a significant head start to give them the sense that they actually might escape. And then Robert would grab his knife and his hunting rifle and he would head out and begin stalking his prey. And for the next several hours or days, he would walk around the woods looking for these women, and he would just stay off, watching what they were doing. And at some point, he would sneak up on them and he would wound them intentionally, usually with his knife, and then he had a blood trail to follow. And he would follow these dying women who were screaming out for help, and at some point, these women would know they were going to die. There was no hope for them, and they would collapse or they would stop, and at that point, Robert would walk up to them and he would shoot them. Afterwards, he would remove their handcuffs, he would redress them, and then he would bury them in a shallow grave. Before he was carted off to prison to serve a life sentence without the possibility of parole, he was brought out by authorities to help identify where other grave sites were in that hunting area. But he was only able to find 8 additional victims because he would go to different grave sites and the remains would not be there anymore, most likely because animals had ransacked the area, or he just simply forgot where it was, or he didn't want to share any more information with police. Robert never confirmed if all 37 of those X's on that map that was found are actual sites of victims that he buried. But investigators say that's exactly what they were, and in fact, many believe there are other maps with more X's on them. But the police could only confirm 17 victims. If there were more, we probably will never know, because in 2014, Robert died in prison and he took those secrets to the grave.